Hello everybody. So, I am going to make another fanfiction. We'll do another fanfiction right now. It's not Voltron this time. It's going to be another fanfiction that I'm going to read. And there's a lot of people recommended me to do. No, not a lot of people recommended me, but this one caught me in attention. It's called The Space Between. It's My Hero Academia. Because I'm a little fan of My Hero Academia myself, because I have the shirts, I have the collectibles, I got everything. But this one caught me in attention because I like My Hero Academia and all other theories. There are the relationships. There's some characters that I know. Here are some additional tags. Slowburn, Katsuki swears a lot. Is bad at feelings. That's referring to Bakugo. With the BAMF Midoriya. And then this is the point of all these point of view to Midoriya. It's no quirks. In My Hero Academia, there are no quirks whatsoever. And it's a modern setting. It's a today's setting. We have emotional constipation, eventual romance, character development, love and angst. Okay, the age up characters, they aged up to 15 and turn into an adult. Sexual content, belligerent sexual tension. I like your vocabulary. It's a banned fiction. Yeah, you used to have banned. Minor violence and injury recovery. It's a good choice. Very good choice. So, for the first time that I will not be reading this fic, why not? I'll let the AI do its own work for me. It's been a long time since I'm reading a lot, since 2016. It has been 5 years already since I've read this whole stuff, from start to finish. Let me explain this whole thing. So, why not let the AI thing do the reading of the fanfiction for me? So, I'm gonna give you guys the review. I will test it out and see what it's gonna be look like. So, AI, do the cue.
Holding his expensive camera tightly between his hands, Midoriya Izuku looked up at the once white letters displayed on the black storefront banner. The hard luck bar, he murmured to himself, unsure if he was getting ready to enter or flee. Amateur photographer Midoriya Izuku is stuck in a rut and desperate for a change of pace. Deep in his city's grimy underbelly, he finds exactly what he's looking for in the form of an underground punk sensation on the verge of their big break, fronted by a foul-mouthed firework of a human being. Loud, brash, and passionate, Izuku may have just found the creative spark he needed, as well as something new to set his soul ablaze.
So, you understand how this reading the fanfiction work with an AI? Yeah. And oh yeah, there's gonna be a lot of good stuff going on between Midoriya and Bakugo. Doing a lot of good stuff, and he takes pictures and see in this club or like a bar or something like that, and you saw everything they had there. It's wild. It's really wild. So let's just start reading the chapter 1. Now, I'm not gonna read this one. I'll let the AI do its stuff. So let's get started, shall we? Yeah, let's go. Before we start reading this, shout out to Kanae VR for writing this fic. Yes, follow her on Twitter and Tumblr.
The Space Between. By Connie_VR, Chapter 1. Angels with Dirty Faces.
We're the people you don't want to know. We come from places you don't want to go.
Holding his expensive camera tightly between his hands, Midoriya Izuku looked up at the once white letters displayed on the black storefront banner. He bit his lip in apprehension, glancing up and down the street both ways. The sun had long faded and there was a chill in the air, a slight wind rustling his already tousled black-green curls. The hard luck bar, he murmured to himself, unsure if he was getting ready to enter or flee. A couple passed by him, a man and a woman. The woman had vivid green hair and at least a dozen safety pins through her ears. Izuku could hear the volume of the bar's interior increase dramatically as they opened the door and entered. Looked like the show had already started. He stared at the door, fidgeting. You wanted this, he reminded himself. He peered at the upcoming event posters plastered messily against the bar's windows in the dark. He'd never heard of any of these bands. Izuku was more used to heavily stylized beards and jeans, campy t-shirts, and floral dresses. Acoustic guitars and pretty melodies. This was black and red, torn pants and chains, ink, and middle fingers. There was a poster advertising a band named Blood Orgy. This hadn't been what Izuku had expected when his co-worker had told him about the place. Looking back on it now though, the too wide smile and double thumbs up probably should have tipped him off. Izuku sighed, wondering if he should just go home. It was late and he was tired. Maybe he'd come back another day when he hadn't had to work well into the evening. He shook his head and took a step back only to nearly collide with a large, muscled man with a shaved head passing by behind him. Watch it, the man snapped at him, flexing his arm, and Izuku briefly wondered if he was about to get punched. I'm SOR-, he started to say, but the man had already disappeared into the bar, not even bothering with Izuku long enough to let him deliver an apology. A spark of annoyance lit him as he stared after the man. Frowning, Izuku brought his camera up and snapped a quick picture of the bar's front. To hell with it. He'd already taken the time to come all the way here and he wasn't leaving without results, even if the place was a little divey. He nodded to himself in affirmation. He was Midoriya Izuku, after all. If his boss wasn't willing to give him the opportunities he needed, he'd push his career by himself. Izuku rubbed his hands together, then grabbed the door and thrust it open, taking several bold steps inside before he had a chance to change his mind. The first thing that struck him was the loudness, and then the heat. The sound from the show was deafening, the air thick. Izuku stood by the entrance for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. Once he could see well enough, he strode over to the bar running lengthwise across the far wall. It was peppered with an assortment of people Izuku would never run into in his daily life. Izuku leaned against the scratched-up wooden top in what he imagined was a casual way, determined to fit in. "Ah, one rum and coke, please," he shouted pleasantly over the roar, holding up his finger. The girl with a buzz cut and frighteningly large ear gauges standing behind the counter gave him an odd look as she nodded almost imperceptibly. Izuku glanced around the interior as the bartender prepared his drink. Nearly everyone was wearing some variation of black with the odd flash of red or white or neon. Many patrons had multiple tattoos or piercings. Some were wearing hardly any clothing at all. He felt horribly out of place in his green and gray plaid button-up and appropriately fitted dark wash jeans. 6, Izuku suddenly heard in his ear. Lost in his thoughts, Izuku startled and the bartender eyed him suspiciously. "And your ID?" Izuku flushed, frantically pulling out his ID and a few bills. He grabbed the plastic cup, a dried-out lime wedge pressed into the rim, and retreated in embarrassment deeper into the venue. Apparently he wasn't the only one who felt he stood out. The bar was narrow, but deep. Beyond the long counter and the several old wooden tables and chairs was the source of the loudness and heat. A small crowd of people and a half-flight of stairs mostly obscured Izuku's view, but there seemed to be some sort of elevated stage at the back of the place. Letting his camera hang from its thick strap around his neck, Izuku held his drink as he paid the monster of a bouncer admission, earning him a stamp on his wrist, then took the plunge down. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Izuku quickly realized that the noise and heat from before had only been a lazy introduction to what was going on down here. A band consisting of 3 guitarists and a drummer were already well into their act, going full throttle. The stage itself was quite small, no more than a few feet off the ground and maybe 20 feet wide. The music ricocheted off the red walls and ceiling of the confined space, the heat seeping through Izuku's clothes and taking root deep in the fabric in a way that was uncomfortable and sticky. Izuku stayed near the back for a while, the music throbbing in his temples, and tried to put forth the appearance that alcohol and him were close friends and not distant relatives. He sipped his drink tentatively, grimacing over the watered-down taste, and knocked the sad lime into it. After a moment he set the drink down by his foot and took a few half-hearted photographs. By the band's third or fourth song, however, and well into his drink, Izuku was starting to grow accustomed to the volume. By the time he'd finished his drink, a small smile was growing on his face. The female vocalist was flailing around on stage as she sang in an unusually husky voice, her long bleached blonde and red hair flying everywhere. Their music was loud and vulgar, but it was also passionate and raw in a way that Izuku found he didn't mind. He'd never really had a rebellious phase, but he could see the appeal of this sort of thing to certain people. Finishing his drink and feeling a little braver, Izuku decided to wander around a bit. As he kept to the walls he noticed that there were a number of old photographs from past shows hung on them. He presumed they were of now famous bands that had once played at the venue, but Izuku only recognized one or two of the names at best. He identified a coat check and, beyond that, a merch table run by a vacant-looking guy with a fahawk. Izuku approached timidly, avoiding the man's gaze and choosing instead to peek at the goods. He felt a little relieved. CDs, T-shirts, the usual. His eyes scanned over a black shirt with bold white letters displaying the words "The Anti-Heroes" in all caps and another with the image of a gun shooting red dollar bills. 20, Izuku heard over his head. He looked up, the fahawk guy was watching him with a dazed expression. His mouth rolled as though he was slowly chewing on something. Huh? Izuku replied, not following. The guy nodded towards the shirts Izuku had been looking at. $20. Oh. Izuku said, speaking loudly over the noise of the band. He took a step back. I'm not. I'm just, he gestured towards his camera. I'm a photographer. The fahawk guy suddenly grinned. You're here for the anti-heroes, he said, and Izuku was lost again. The who? Izuku glanced back down at the shirts. That one band, probably. Fahawk huffed in disapproval and narrowed his eyes. What are you, new? Very, Izuku said, letting it slip out without thinking. He immediately reddened and started waving his arms, backing up. Well, thanks for, he stammered. For what? Yeah, he finished lamely, and he turned around and stiffly walked away before he could see whatever face the guy was making at him. It had been a while since he'd embarrassed himself this badly, and Izuku found himself wishing he'd brought a friend, though he doubted any of them would have wanted to go to a place like this. Anxious to escape his embarrassment, Izuku retreated to the stage. As he glanced back towards the stairs, he could see that the room's capacity had easily doubled since he'd arrived. It was starting to get crowded. The same lead singer was currently belting out some of the most colorful lyrics Izuku had ever heard, and it was a welcome distraction. After another song or two, Izuku braved the audience to try and get closer. He was noticing a pleasant buzz from his one drink, and some of his anxiousness slipped away as he angled his camera and moved around to try and get some better shots of the vocalist. The attendees were packed tightly by the front. He'd need to practice sneaking in and out of crowds if he decided to continue this sort of thing in the future. As their next song ended, the female vocalist played a guitar riff and screamed into the mic. You posers ready for the anti-heroes? Izuku had become immersed in the performance and was startled by the absolute roar that came back from the crowd. He craned his neck around and realized that the bar as far back as he could see was filled to beyond capacity. Where had all these people come from? There were easily over 100 packed into the stage area alone. It was slightly claustrophobic, but Izuku only felt exhilarated as he fed off the excitement from the cries of the crowd. It was hard not to cheer along. Good, the vocalist shouted. We're Pussy Magnet, and I hope we've gotten your good and hard for the rest of the night. As they blasted into their final song, Izuku chuckled and shook his head, wondering what his mother would think of all this. He decided right then never to tell her. As the band wrapped up, instead of the crowd dispersing, it only drew closer. Izuku found himself being pressed forward until he was maybe 20 feet away from the stage and surrounded by people on all sides. The closeness made him acutely aware of his own dampness, and he pulled his button-up off in mild disgust and tied it around his waist. He fanned himself with his hand and flapped the edge of his white t-shirt, the warm air not providing much relief. He hadn't even realized he was sweating. There was shuffling around on stage as a group of hefty guys in black t-shirts and jeans came up from the back and started moving equipment around. The crowd tittered and pressed closer. Izuku took the opportunity to sort through the pictures he'd taken, analyzing them with a concentrated frown. He played around with the lens, making some adjustments, lifting the camera up to the stage and back down again several times. The photos were all right, but he'd need to really get close to get some good shots. He bit his lip as he considered how he might accomplish this when suddenly all of the lights went out. The crowd let up a cheer, several girls screamed, and Izuku barely had time to register the anticipation in his stomach when a hard electric guitar sounded at ear-splitting volume and the stage lights blazed back on in a fury of red and white that temporarily blinded him. The band exploded into song, and the crowd exploded along with it. Within seconds Izuku was standing in the middle of a massive mosh pit, and it was all he could do to clutch desperately at his camera and keep himself upright as he was tossed around. What was this? If the band before had been loud, he didn't even know what to call this. He could feel the drums in his chest like a heartbeat, the music so loud he could barely register the sounds the crowd was making around him. Finally catching his feet, his heart beating wildly, Izuku managed to look up properly and get a glimpse of the band from around the glare of the lights. There were 3 of them, 2 guys and a girl. One of the guys sat behind the drums, gripping the drumsticks hard as he slammed them into the offending instrument with fervor. His hair was spiked into an odd hairstyle and bright red, a large, toothy grin spread across his face making him look slightly crazed. The girl was probably the oddest looking of the 3. She gripped her bass with equal enthusiasm, jumping around like a rodent on fire. Her entire face was covered with neon pink face paint, and she must have been wearing some sort of contact lens because her eyes were unnervingly black with yellow irises. Her hair was pink enough to rival her face, and she wore a pair of devil horn hair clips on her head. Her tank top read in big bold letters Alien Queen, and on top of that, she was wearing strange green and purple camouflage hot pants. The lead singer also held a guitar. Despite the girl's odd appearance, he was by far the most striking of the 3. Izuku couldn't place his finger on exactly what it was, but the man held an aura of intrigue that the audience seemed to latch onto and feed off of. His presence dominated the entirety of the stage like it was an extension of his own body. His stance held an air of undeniable confidence and unbridled aggression. His hair was ash blonde and short, spiking out in every direction. Izuku couldn't tell if he had styled it that way or if it was natural. He wore a tight black tank top with a large white skull emblazoned on the front. The cut showed off his well-defined arms and broad, heavily muscled shoulders. It also partially obscured a tattoo that stretched across his chest, making it impossible to read. As he moved his hands along his guitar, his muscles and tendons shifted in a way that exuded power. He had smeared some kind of black grease paint across his eyes haphazardly, making them look concealed as if by a mask, but it was his eyes that stood out the most. Their piercing redness stood in stark contrast to the black around them, and Izuku was quite certain he'd never seen eyes that color before. He glared down at his audience in a way that was both incredibly intimidating and inconceivably alluring. And his voice. Izuku wasn't sure if he was shouting or singing, but it was perfectly in key and the man barely looked like he was trying at all. No, perhaps that wasn't right, he was definitely trying. Beads of sweat were already forming on his skin, his face furrowed in a look that could wilt flowers. Izuku was sure the energy he was giving off could power a home. But even so, Izuku got the impression that the man could make almost any sound and it would come out perfectly in key and full of purpose. He sang at an almost inhuman volume, voice gravelly, his fingers not missing a second on the guitar. At one point he stomped over to one of the amps and kicked it for no discernible reason, still playing his guitar while it fell over with a loud thud. Izuku wasn't totally sure if he was performing or getting ready to punch someone's lights out.
Life's gonna me? You got it all wrong. Life is my... I'll stop when I want.
The mosh pit surrounding Izuku had not ebbed in intensity, and in the brief glimpses he could get around the room, Izuku had spotted at least 2 fights breaking out. It was unlike anything Izuku had ever been to before, and he found himself getting caught up in the energy. The antiheroes were a few songs in before Izuku realized he hadn't been taking any photos. He was still getting thrown around, but he raised his camera anyways, praying it would make it through to the end of the night. After taking a few shaky shots, Izuku learned not to fight the flow of the crowd. There was no point trying to stand still in a moving pit unless he wanted to get trampled. It'd be hard to get quality photos, but that was why he'd brought his Nikon. After 10 or so minutes of experimenting with focuses and settings and adjusting for the bright lights, he found himself getting into the groove of things. He managed to get a few wide shots of the band, but if he wanted to get the really good stuff, he needed to get in close. He spotted a couple of photographers with mid-range cameras closer to the stage. How had they managed it? Izuku tried to edge his way into the packed stage front, a near impossible feat for someone as polite as himself. He wasn't bold enough to force his way through, at least not until he accidentally stomped on the heel of the girl in front of him. "Ow, what the f***?" the woman yelled. Izuku didn't even have a chance to apologize before she turned around, glaring, brought her hand back and smacked Izuku so hard across the face that he reeled back, stunned. This knocked him backwards into a tall guy with a military cut standing right behind him, who did not take kindly to his presence. He shoved Izuku forward with a grunt and back towards the girl, who looked ready to punch him this time. Izuku wondered if he was about to be beaten to death when he felt a sudden sharp pain in his back. He shouted in surprise as he found himself being propelled right past the girl and several others in front of her with a powerful headbutt to the back. Izuku didn't even have time to think about the fierce pain in his back as he immediately found himself one person behind from the front of the stage. Izuku froze, his head still reeling. He had gotten even closer than he had hoped, close enough that the members of the band would easily be able to see him, and it made Izuku want to shrink back. Praying he was more invisible than he felt, Izuku used the opportunity and raised his camera. In all the commotion, it was a miracle that he had managed to hold onto it at all. From this close, the show was a different experience. Izuku could see the way the drummer gripped his drumsticks, the way the girl's feet moved as she jumped around, the way the lead singer's fingers traveled along the guitar strings. Izuku had never been this close to any musician at a show before. He could, in this exact moment, reach out and touch the lead singer if he'd wanted to. Through the lens of his camera, Izuku could see the way the blonde had gotten himself worked up into his own music. Parts of his bangs were stuck to his face and rivulets of sweat were running down his arms. From a distance, he had looked powerful, but from up close, Izuku was bewitched.
"Punk is dead. That's what he said. It's up in the air, face down on the bed."
Izuku wasn't sure if he wanted to laugh or grimace over the lyrics that were spewing from the blonde's mouth. Regardless, Izuku couldn't help but stare, utterly entranced. He quickly forgot his place in the crowd as he watched the man through the lens of his camera, focusing, adjusting angles, appreciating his efforts perhaps a little too enthusiastically. The man's eyes didn't seem to be looking at anything in particular, but for a second, Izuku could have sworn his red eyes drifted his way, and he felt his skin tingle all over. Moments later, the lead singer adjusted his position so that his guitar was angled towards Izuku, his hands' movements on the instrument easy to see from his viewpoint. He tilted his head in a way that caught the lights, blasting through his spiky hair, his eyes glowering forward. If Izuku hadn't known better, he'd think the man was posing. Did musicians do that? Regardless, it worked a little too well, and Izuku managed to get a number of photographs that he was instantly pleased with, his stomach twisting into knots as he found himself desperately hoping the lead singer would glance his way despite his own nervousness. It wasn't meant to be though. Seconds later the blonde moved away from Izuku, focusing his attention on another part of the crowd.
Carbon dioxide is bad, but soup is worse, so shut up and save the earth.
Izuku was feeling rather disappointed when, out of nowhere, he received a blow to his brow, a stray elbow catching him in the face. His expression contorted in pain and he staggered back, within seconds finding himself 4 or 5 people back in the crowd. What a violent show, he thought to himself, rubbing his eye and deciding to focus on the other band members for a while. The show's energy didn't let up for a moment. During a refrain that was particularly heavy on the bass, the pink-faced girl rose to the forefront, swinging herself around and falling to the floor as she hit her chords flawlessly, a cheer rising up from the crowd coupled with chants of Pinky. Pinky. Izuku caught a nice mid-air jump shot of her, but not long after found his eyes being drawn back towards the lead singer. Something about him stirred a feeling in Izuku's gut that made him a little uncomfortable, a little turned on. He'd made peace with his bisexuality over the years, but it wasn't something he often talked about or shared with others. His preferences usually leaned towards women and it had been a while since he'd noticed a guy in that way. But who could blame him, really? The man was objectively attractive, even by non-punk standards. Izuku could see it in the cut of his jawline, the thickness of his neck, the way his tank, slick with sweat, clung to his abdomen, those dangerous, sharp almond-shaped eyes. The show ended too soon with a loud crash of the drums and wail of the guitar. It was a few minutes before Izuku was able to hear anything other than the ringing in his ears and another few to escape from the crowd, retreating to the back of the room to catch his breath. He could feel sweat coating his body, and it was only now that he realized he'd lost his button-up somewhere on the floor. Now that the high from the show was wearing off, his temple and back throbbed, and Izuku rubbed at his face again. He vaguely wondered what time it was as he rifled through his pictures. He deleted a few, but he smiled over more. Izuku wasn't one to pat himself on the back, but for his first up-close and personal show, he felt he hadn't done half bad. Izuku glanced away from his camera a few minutes later and noticed that a small crowd had gathered around the merch table. He assumed it was just fans wanting to buy merch until he saw a flash of spiked red hair. Izuku watched a little longer. Sure enough, it looked like at least one of the band members, the drummer, was standing over there chatting with fans. There were a number of people surrounding him. Looking down at his camera, Izuku was struck with a sudden idea. He passed through his photos, selecting one of his strongest, and, with a fierceness probably brought out by the show, strode over towards the redhead. It took a few minutes for Izuku to get his attention, and he watched as the drummer chatted in a surprisingly friendly manner to fans as one of them bought a CD. It made Izuku think that maybe the whole aggressive "fuck you" energy thing was an act for the sake of showmanship. Maybe they were all really nice people. Eventually the fans left, and the redhead turned his gaze towards Izuku, the same toothy smile on his face from before. "Hi," Izuku started, rubbing the back of his head awkwardly. He wasn't sure how to go about this. "You guys were really great." "Hey, thanks man," the redhead said enthusiastically, beaming. He looked him up and down. "Your first time?" "Yeah," Izuku admitted, feeling more than a little self-conscious that it was that obvious to literally everyone he spoke with. He paused for a moment. "I'm a photographer," he said. "I took some photos. Do you want to, maybe?" Izuku could feel his face heating up. Surely the redhead didn't want to be bothered by him, he was probably wasting his time. Nonetheless, he angled his camera towards the drummer and he stepped to Izuku's side to get a better look. The first photo was one that Izuku had taken of the lead singer, an action shot from the torso up, his eyes closed and screaming into the mic, his hands gripping his guitar and the bright lights glaring through his hair. Izuku scanned through a couple of others, and the redhead whistled. "Hey, you're not half bad," the redhead said encouragingly. "You a professional." Izuku's heart soared at these words. "Ah, well, sort of." Izuku started before promptly getting cut off by the drummers shouting, "Hey! Baku Ground Zero." Izuku followed the redhead's gaze to the other side of the room and felt his stomach clench when he saw who it led to. The lead singer, the blonde Ground Zero, was looking right at them, his brow furrowed. It looked like they caught him halfway through signing something belonging to a female fan. How had Izuku not noticed him? "What?" he said in a clipped manner. The redhead was unperturbed. "See me a sec," he said, gesturing enthusiastically towards Izuku, who felt an anticipatory fear grip him as he saw those red eyes shift his way, his posture straightening unconsciously. The blonde turned back towards the fan and finished whatever he was doing, then stalked over to them. Izuku could only watch helplessly, stunned, as Ground Zero approached, stopping just short of the redhead. Up close, Izuku was surprised to realize the blonde was only slightly taller than himself, an inch at most. The elevated stage had given off a different impression. At the same time, however, Izuku also became painfully aware of their difference in physique. Sure, Izuku was decently toned, as one had to be when carrying around heavy equipment and regularly spending 12 hours or longer on your feet, but this guy was on a whole other level. Ground Zero looked at him expectantly, and Izuku realized he was staring. Panicking, he tried to get a hold of his thoughts. What had he come here for again? As he scrambled, the blonde made an expression of extreme annoyance. "What, you want an autograph or some shit?" he grunted. That got Izuku going. No. I mean, maybe. But he's a photographer," the drummer provided helpfully, looking at Izuku with an amused expression, as though he'd seen this 100 times before. "Yeah, well, who isn't?" Ground Zero retorted. Nonetheless, he swung over to Izuku in a couple of easy strides, and with shaking hands Izuku held up his camera, going through the same photos, trying to ignore the heat that he could feel coming off the blonde's body, the smell of his sweat that was still slick on his shirt. "TCH, Ground Zero said, unimpressed. "Not that great. Kind." At those words Izuku deflated. The drummer seemed to have liked them, though. He hung his head, and the blonde stepped away. "What's your name?" he demanded suddenly, looking at Izuku sharply. "Midoriya Izuku," Izuku mumbled, head down. "What?" The blonde made a face. "Did you just say Deku?" "Izuku," Izuku repeated just as a shout went up from another area of the room. Ground Zero looked at the redhead. "He said Deku, right?" The redhead opened his mouth to respond when the blonde suddenly growled, distracted. "F***, that guy strung out again," he asked incredulously, staring at the fahawked guy at the merch booth that Izuku had spoken to earlier. Izuku looked over to see the guy currently staring at a bill like it held the secrets of the universe. "Think so, yeah," the drummer replied non-committally, shooting Izuku a sympathetic look. "F***, the blonde repeated with more emphasis. "If anything goes missing, I'll kick his scrawny ass myself." He rolled his shoulders as he dug his hand into his pocket, pulling out a small black plastic case and tossing it towards the redhead, who caught it easily. "I'm going to the back. Shirt's fucking soaked." With those parting words, Ground Zero trudged off, feet heavy on the ground as he rounded the corner of the stage and disappeared from view. Izuku wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry over the exchange that had just happened. Izuku started, gesturing over his shoulder with his thumb, ready to get the hell out of there. "What? Wait, no, the redhead said, fiddling with the case. One side popped open and revealed a small stack of cards. The drummer took one and handed it to Izuku expectantly. "Here, take this," he said. Izuku accepted the item and turned it over. It appeared to be a business card. Izuku spotted a phone number and email address immediately. He gripped it and looked at the redhead questioningly, who grinned. "He must have seen something he liked," the redhead said, closing the case and pocketing it, and Izuku picked his heart right back up off the floor. "Really?" Izuku said, unable to help the wide grin that was spreading over his features. "I thought dash." "No worries," the redhead said, shaking his head. "He's like that. Don't take it personally." He leaned in towards Izuku. "Listen, though. Don't pass that card around. We've had some trouble with over-enthusiastic fans in the past, if you catch my drift." He stepped back again. "Once you're done messing around with your photos, shoot them our way. If we like 'em, we'll post them on our socials, shout you out and all that." Any previous disappointment felt by Izuku was long forgotten by this point. "Oh wow, really? That'd be amazing," he said enthusiastically, beaming. "I've been wanting to focus on more of my own work, but it's hard to get followers and I don't get too much practice at my job besides product shots, although sometimes I do get to work with models, but I can't use that stuff anyways because it's owned by the company, so I thought that maybe if I got out and did some local events and news and things like that, I could develop myself more, since I really need a stronger portfolio to showcase my abilities." The redhead listened patiently as Izuku rambled on, lost in his own thoughts, but eventually he interrupted him with a friendly pat on the shoulder. "Well, good luck with all that," he said, smiling, "but seriously, you're pretty good. When you're ready, send us your stuff." He grinned. "Don't make us wait too long, though." "Oh." The redhead extended his hand. "I'm Red Riot, by the way, but you can call me Kirishima." "You're Deku." Izuku, he corrected, shaking the drummer's hand enthusiastically. "Midoriya Izuku." "Right on, Midoriya," he repeated, laughing. He released his hand and rubbed his ear, twisting his finger in the canal. "Sorry about that. We're all a little deaf," he said jokingly. He rocked back on his heels and stretched a little. "Think I gotta get going. Pinky's waiting for us to load up mobile. Good to meet ya though." Izuku nodded like a bobblehead, not entirely understanding Kirishima's words but still smiling like an idiot as the redhead walked backwards away from him. "You too," he said, waving. "I'll get you those photos as soon as I can." Kirishima grinned and gave him a thumbs up before turning around and leaving. Izuku stood there for some time, feeling incredibly pleased with himself. He'd done it. He braved a foreign bar, attended an underground concert, taken some great photos, talked to the band, and promoted himself as a photographer. He wasn't quite sure what to make of Ground Zero, but at least Kirishima had turned out to be a good guy. Plus the show itself had been, all in all, pretty great. For now, there was only one thing left to do. His smile not fading in the slightest, Izuku approached the merch table, the fahawked guy looking at Izuku without the slightest hint of recognition in his face. Unperturbed by this, Izuku bounced on the balls of his feet and gestured towards the t-shirts he had seen earlier, specifically the one that said "The Anti-Heroes." "I'll take a medium, please," Izuku said.